Speaker introducing the meeting today is Anna Alexander, who's on the editorial team of the International Socialism Journal. The edition here, Anna's written an article on revisiting the dynamics of imperialism in the Middle East that you can get from the ISJ stall in the other room. So Anna's going to speak for 30 minutes now, so over to Anna.
Thanks, comrades. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Also, please don't clap. I haven't said anything yet. You're allowed to clap afterwards. Or maybe not. So, thanks for the introduction. And I just want to start by giving a brief kind of sketch of the themes that I'm going to touch on in this meeting. Now, obviously, talking about this topic is always complicated. And the last few weeks have demonstrated yet again how important what happens in the Middle East is to global politics, and also how important it is to what happens in this country. We can see in so many ways, actually, in the last few weeks, how the crisis in the region also has multiple ways in which it becomes a crisis of British politics. It becomes a crisis that affects us directly and feeds into what we do in our workplaces, what we do in the streets, how we interact with the state, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the reasons why I think understanding what happens in the region through a Marxist analysis is incredibly important. What I'm going to be focusing on in this particular meeting is actually quite a historical look at how imperialism has developed in the region, and focus on a particular aspect of analysing imperialism, which is the development of a dynamic of imperialist competition between the states of the region. In particular, the largest and most powerful regional states, of which Israel is one, but also I'll be talking about Iran, I'll talk about the states of the Gulf, at the moment particularly Saudi Arabia and UAE, Turkey to a certain extent. But I want to set that in the context of how the competition between those states has developed historically, and how it relates to the way in which imperialism works at, you could say, the top level of the global system. How the region has been central to actually the configuration and reconfiguration of power between the biggest capitalist states on the globe. And what the changes at that level of the system mean for both the region and more centrally. The reason why I'm doing it this way is partly to challenge a kind of common understanding of imperialism, which I think is far too limited. What I'm thinking about here is the way in which sometimes the label imperialism is simply attached to the US and its allies, the actions of the United States and Western powers. That those are sometimes considered to be the only powers that are imperialist, and that others that are challenging them are somehow either socialist, as is sometimes claimed about China or was claimed about Russia. Neither of this, in neither case was this true, I would argue, or is sometimes also labelled considered to be a way of thinking about smaller states like Iran, for example, in the Middle East. So what I want to do is to sketch out briefly how it is that imperialism works. What is imperialism in relation to capitalism, and then try and explain how we get to the current situation. I will try and talk a bit about the events of the last few weeks, but if I don't go into a lot of detail, then we can discuss that we can go on to that in the discussion. But the idea is to lay out an approach that helps set a theoretical framework to understand the most recent events. So the first point to say here is, again, to root an understanding of what imperialism is in a Marxist understanding of how the economy works, and an understanding that capitalist competition is the driving force for imperialism. Imperialism is in a sense, the fusion of competition between states, geopolitical competition, and economic competition. And one of the things that was characteristic of the rise of the term imperialism as a strand within Marxist understanding, it was a response to developments of the late 19th century, where Marxists, and actually also liberals as well, analysts of the global economy could see that there was an increasing tendency towards a fusion between what states were doing to compete militarily, which obviously has happened before capitalism. This is not something that is a new feature of human society. It's a feature of class society, with the drive towards forms of industrial production, the grabbing raw materials, particular forms of technology, and so on. In particular, a drive towards the modernization of the means of warfare, the production of new weapons, and the channeling of productive capacity into those areas. In the late 19th century, the other thing that was happening, though, that was extremely important was that as, for example, rearmament or armament and competition between countries such as Germany and Britain. Britain was then the largest capitalist power, the biggest imperial hegemon of the day, is that, of course, that also unfolded in a context where you had the massive grab of the rest of the world mainly largely by the European powers of the day, and the parcelling up of Africa in particular, the intensification of colonization in Asia. And this unfolded in a context of acute crises for the people who experienced that process. I mean, I don't know if people have ever read Mike Davis's fantastic book, Late Victorian Holocausts, which talks about how climate changes of the day, it was around the El Nino effect, interacted with financial disciplining of societies that were becoming part of the world market, and colonial land grabs and so on, created the conditions for absolutely catastrophic famines and so on. So that process, that brutal process of colonization, was unfolding at the same time as competition was intensifying in the center of the system. And of course, the Middle East, or the area that was going to be called the Middle East by Orientalists and imperial administrators, was central to that process. And in particular, one of the driving factors of making the region so important was the role of oil, the discovery of oil in the region. It coincided with in fact, a shift from a coal-based power for the biggest capitalist powers, Britain in particular, but also Germany, towards oil being the kind of fuel of empire and fuel of capitalist growth. It's no accident that if you look at the shift in terms of the big powers at the top of the system, the ones that become the most powerful in the 20th century were driving that shift towards an oil economy. Russia, the Russian Empire had actually very large access to oil, and the Soviet Union later, but also particularly the US itself. The US has massive oil reserves, and the oil boom of the late 19th century laid the foundations for the US's emergence on the global stage. So this is also an important note that the US, as an oil, as an oil-powered imperial power, was never trying to get hold of the oil of the Middle East because it needed it itself. It was much more about controlling the flow of that and to be able to supply its allies, for example, in Europe. And it's also important to note as well that although sometimes these shifts in kind of energy regimes are called energy transitions, it's much more accurate to say that you're talking about energy accumulations, because it's not that they abandon using the old fossil fuel. You actually have an addition of other sources of energy. But at the same time as you have this process of changes at the top of the global system, so take the, for example, the US and then the Soviet Union coming to dominate the global system in the 20th century and the decline of the British Empire, you also have capitalism developing and spreading, if you like, downwards to new capitalist powers emerging, new centres of capital accumulation developing, which are independent, in fact, of the old core of the system in Europe and then its extensions in, say, into the US. You have a process that is gone through by multiple different, emerging capitalist powers of waves of kind of industrial production, often starting with textile production, then moving on to, for example, what's often called the kind of Fordist term of automobile production, then into consumer electronics, which is one of the powering shifts in the way that the world economy works from the mid-20th century onwards, and is one of the foundations, in fact, of the rise of East Asian capitalism, of the centre of capital accumulation that emerges in East Asia. So competition is carried on between the big powers at the top of the system, but also starts to move its way down the system. So what's this got to do with how competition between states in the Middle East works? Well, actually, you can see how this plays itself out from the late 1950s into the 1960s. In fact, in some areas of the Middle East, even before that. Take, for example, the development of the cotton industry in a country like Egypt. Egypt was, in the 19th century, was forced to become a kind of cotton plantation, a primary product producer to feed the mills of Lancashire. Any attempt to produce independent, to produce spun cotton independently was actually crushed by European powers. But by the 20th century, Egypt was home to the biggest textile mill in the Middle East at Mahal al-Kubra, 30,000 workers. And post-World War II, you have Egypt emerges under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was an army officer who helped seize power, pushed the British out militarily. Britain had been the imperial power in Egypt, and tried to direct the resources of the state into developing vertically integrated textile production and heavy industry and so on. This laid the basis really for Egypt's attempt to emerge as a powerful regional state, one that was independent politically of its old imperial master, challenged through military means, political and diplomatic means, Britain and France, the Suez Crisis, it ended up going head to head with Israel in 1967 in the war, the Six Day War. I'll come back to the importance of that later. But one of the purposes of the Six Day War was precisely to discipline Egypt under Nasser's the emerging Egyptian independent ruling class through military means, but also in order to assert economic control over the region, or to ensure that the development of capitalism in the region would be also shaped by and contained by the kind of political within the Western the alliances of Western powers, which the US was now taking over from Britain as the key global power. So it's not an accident that after 1967, this ushered in a period not only of Egypt's then subsequent rulers after Nasser's death making peace with Israel, becoming allied to the US, but also opened the door to neoliberal reforms which took place in the 1970s, 1980s. So it's a good example of how economic and political aspects of imperialism intertwine. If we look then at, for example, another important power in the region take Iran. So Iran was actually a state that didn't experience direct colonialism, unlike Egypt. It was the kind of rump of a powerful regional empire going back to the under several different dynasties. And although was dominated by external states, wasn't subject to direct colonialism in quite the same way as some of the other countries in the region. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Iranian monarchy was strongly allied with the US, and in fact the US intervened very directly to stop the rise of, for example, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the nationalist prime minister, who was overthrown in a coup engineered by the US in the 1950s. Again, precisely to avoid a state, the Iranian state becoming too independent, if you like, politically of the US. And this fundamentally shaped really how how both the politics and economics of Iran at that period developed. This led to all sorts of contradictions in the development of Iranian capitalism. There was attempts at a land reform. There was attempts to move towards industrialization. Iran benefited massively from the importance of the oil industry, modern oil industry, and at the end of the 1960s, Iran, despite being allied to the US politically at this time, is also one of a group of states of oil producers which again start to try and assert their independence of the big powers at the top of the capitalist system through the formation of a cartel, OPEC, the oil producing states, which tries to set prices for oil that then could be used, the idea was, to fuel independent economic development. At this point, the Iranian regime under the monarchy, as I said, an ally of the US. In fact, it's one of the pillars of the US of US support in the region, alongside Israel. That changes fundamentally in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, a revolution from below, which is led, at least in terms of the organising on the ground, is led by the poor and particularly by workers. Actually, organised workers in, for example, the oil industry play an enormously important role in the Iranian Revolution. Politically, the Iranian Revolution is dominated, though, by Islamist organisations. You see the rise of Islamist current, which then comes to take state power, led by Ruhollah Khomeini, and that's the base of the regime, which is still in power today. So, revolution in 1979 created the conditions for a fundamental geopolitical change in one of the major regional powers. Overnight, in a sense, Iran went from being a staunch ally of the US to US diplomats having to flee, but trying to burn and shred all of their secret cables, and so on and so forth. How did the US respond to this? Well, actually, you saw then competition being played out with another regional state, with Iraq, which borders Iran. The US, the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, and by the end of the 1980s was being absolutely, weapons were flowing from the US into Iraq in order to try and defeat the Iranian regime. So again, you can see that the role of those regional powers is extremely important in the dynamics of competition at that level. I want to say something briefly now, though, about the specificities of the Israeli state and what it represents in the region. Because, again, if we think about the ways in which imperialism works both as competition between big powers at the top of the system and how it relates to processes of the forcible spread of capitalism through colonialism. You can see that the Israeli state plays a very specific and actually unusual role in terms of it being still a still existing settler colonial state, which is, you know, in terms of its political system, was formed in the 1940s. The apartheid system that dominates in Palestine today, Israeli apartheid, was set up in the 1940s in terms of achieving state power. Obviously, the roots of colonization in Palestine go much before that, but the emergence of a settler colony that is an apartheid state dates to the time of the Nakba in 1947, 1948. It's actually exactly the same period that apartheid was instituted in that form in South Africa. It's also actually the same time that there's a process towards other, I mean, for example, the Rhodesian state. It's a very similar period. This was in what is now Zimbabwe and was overthrown and defeated by the National Liberation Movement. In the settler colony in Algeria, also went through similar processes in kind of political radicalization in the 1950s and 1960s. So this the kind of settler colonial dynamics of what the Israeli state represents are something that are of a particular historical moment. But we have to ask then, why did it persist beyond? Why do we still have the Israeli state in that form? Why is it actually continuing to kind of radicalize in terms of its politics? And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One of which is to do with the specificity of the regions, the Middle East as a region, and the importance of oil to the global political economy. And that also the long-term importance of Israel as what's sometimes called a watchdog state for US interests in the region, where again, as a kind of armed settler colony, a kind of, you know, one which is armed and supported by as a kind of garrison citadel, if you like, in the region, is supported by the US. But there have been things that have shifted since the 1960s, and I want to just spend a few minutes kind of trying to explain how history has moved on, both on the geopolitical level, but also in terms of in terms of the political economy of the region and of those major states that are competing with each other in the region. So one of the things that we have seen in the case of all of the powers that are currently the most important militarily and economically in the region, is that they have all moved beyond a stage of dependence entirely on either rents from, say, oil or direct subsidies from the big imperial powers. In the case of the Israel, I'll take Israel first. The Israeli economy, the foundations of it in in fact, even before the Nakba, were in two areas. One was a kind of agricultural version of apartheid, which was a sort of plantation economy style. If people may remember who are older, one of the things that we all used to boycott was the oranges. Actually, we need to it's more the high-tech industries now that Israel is trying to export, software services, and so on. That's an example of how the political economy of the Israeli state has shifted. And with the growth of that high-tech industry, actually a degree of independence has emerged, or at least as much bigger space where the Israeli ruling class can move, in ways following its own wishes, as opposed to being a kind of puppet simply of the US. This is related to the degree to which there is an capital accumulation takes place in a dynamic way inside the Israeli economy. And it's also very significant that, of course, those high-tech industries are the ones that absolutely exclude Palestinians entirely and are extremely racially segregated because they're often conditional on serving in the Israeli army. So it's important to say that because sometimes there is a tendency, I think, to see the Israeli state as simply a puppet of the US. I don't think that's true. And we also have to take into account that at the same time as you have a more powerful and a more aggressive Israeli ruling class emerging, you also have a weakening of the US's role at the centre of the global system. You have the crisis of the US as the centre of the capitalist system has been intensifying in recent years, and you can see that actually again play out at a regional level. The US attempted to has asserted itself by defeating and attacking directly states in the region, particularly Iraq, which, if you remember, as I just explained, Iraq had been the ally of the US in the 1980s, had been used as a vehicle to defeat Iran. Within a few years, the US was invading Iraq, and then, in fact, invading twice in 1991 and 2003. What were the outcomes of the 2003 invasion of Iraq for the US? Actually, it was disastrous. The US, it was much more disastrous for Iraqis, but from the US point of view, it was an utter disaster. It was as significant as the defeat in Vietnam in the 1960s. It involved, invading and conquering the country in a few weeks in 2003, and then having to invade and conquer it again and again and again. An acute loss of troops, and even more catastrophically, actually, the loss of influence, the political. The loss of political control over the Iraqi state to Iran, to the Iranian regime that began to rebuild its political influence out of the space created by the disaster of the US intervention in Iraq. And that's again an example of how these dynamics at the top and bottom of the system interact. Can I beg a few more minutes? Beyond half an hour, because I need to tie this together and talk a little bit about what's happened in the last in the last year and a half. So the reason I spent the time trying to talk through some of those historical dynamics is I think it's fundamental to understanding in the right way how to position yourself as a socialist in relation to what's going on in the region. It helps to explain, I think, why we are completely and utterly and always opposed to our own imperialist powers, to the role of the British state, to the role of the US state, which is the one that the British ruling class is most closely allied with, and that is our first and primary duty. But nevertheless, that actually the regional powers are also engaged in pursuit of their own interests, their own ends, at the expense of ordinary people in the region and to their terrible cost. 1 million people died in the war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. And the level of destruction that we see and the horrors of the genocide in Gaza it demonstrate that spectre of war is being driven by the way that capitalism works. Remember, I mentioned about the question of consumer electronics. In modern warfare, not only in the Middle East but everywhere, this means production of drones. And drone production is based on your consumer electronics production base. In order to be able to turn out the number of drones that is required for modern warfare, you have to be able to have factories that will produce them or supply chains that will bring you those things. And it's the ability to produce them independently is a very sensitive gauge to how fit that particular power is for competition at both military and political, on a political scale. I mean, you only have to look at the Russia and Ukraine war to see that playing out. There's something like a million drones being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. Again, to go back to the Middle East, in terms of drone production, one of the areas where the Iranian regime has actually innovated successfully is through in production of drones, which it has also sold to Russia. Where did some of the technology for those drones come from? Actually, it's from Israel, because the Iranians shot down an Israeli drone. The pattern, the underlying technology for the Shahed drone is supposed to be, it seems quite likely, was actually from a captured Israeli drone. Turkey is also a major drone producer. And it's one of the vectors where you can see very clearly the interaction between for technological development, production for consumer production, and war playing themselves out in real time. In the last 3 or 4 minutes, which I promise, I do want to speak about what's the alternative, because that in some ways is an extremely bleak picture of endless cycles of war. But I want to go back to some of those big wars and look at the pattern that we've got. I've talked about 1967. There was also wars that took place 1980, 1982, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which incidentally was actually, in terms of the casualty rate, was almost as destructive as the war on Gaza in terms of the numbers of Lebanese and Palestinians killed per day. It didn't go on for so long, and Reagan told Begin to stop it, and Begin actually listened, unlike Netanyahu, who didn't listen to the US. 1991, I mentioned about the US invasion of Iraq. 2003, another invasion of Iraq, and so most of these have at least a very serious potential to have a regional and sometimes global dynamic. 2023, of course, where we have the war that's going on at the moment. The missing decade, if you like, though, is 2013, 2011, 2012. And actually, what happened in that space, where perhaps there should have been a regional war, was revolution from below. Was that the ordinary people of the region, in particular in Tunisia, then Egypt, working classes of the region, asserted itself onto the stage of history and took the fight to the state, took the fight to all of the states in the region. And one of the things about the 2011 wave of revolutions was that it turned out that it wasn't only directed at, for example, the allies of the US. So it started in Tunisia and Egypt, but spread then to Syria. Syria is on the other side of the geopolitical fence. And the means by which that revolutionary movement developed, through strikes, mass protests, and so on, starting to crack apart the role of the state and challenge, in the name of ordinary people, saying we want a different kind of society. That turned out to spread laterally, horizontally, across the entire region. There was a vision of a different world, a different society, that was. It actually, people often talk about the Arab revolutions, but I think that's not really true. If you look at, in terms of the languages, it was also people who speak Amazigh, it was also Kurds, it was also spread to Turkey later. And in fact, in a slightly delayed way, some of that dynamic you can see spreading into Iran. So the uprisings that have taken place in Iran over recent years are fed by that same process of crisis, which generates resistance from below. So, to finish on this point, I think it's very important to see that possibility of revolution from below as a real alternative to imperialism, because it's an alternative not only to the domination by the big imperial powers at the center of the system, but it's also a real alternative to the spreading downwards through the system of those same dynamics of war and crisis. And that's why we absolutely and always stand on the side of ordinary people in the region, and particularly the important role of workers in the region, in providing a genuine alternative to the system of war and chaos that we see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who contributed in the discussion. So I just want to actually start with, I think, the comrade who opened up the discussion, and to say I very much agree with you that it was not the case that the Iranian people chose the mullahs, that the domination of the Iranian state by Khomeini, by the Islamic Republican Party, was a result of the defeat of the popular revolution. There were two revolutions, in a sense, going on at once. There was a revolution, a political revolution that brought a new ruling class into power, but there was a popular revolution from below, which actually had the potential to become something deeper and could have developed towards a socialist revolution if it had gone, if it had gone further. There was absolutely, that possibility was there in 1979, and that the Iranian regime that's in power today came to power out of that process of the counter-revolution against the social revolution from below, even though it was itself a new regime, and one that had got rid of the old ruling class. And I think that's extremely important. I very much agree with the comrade who spoke, who said the Iranian people are the resistance to the Zionist state, to US imperialism, and so on. This is the same, actually, as we saw in Iraq. In Iraq, the vast majority of Iraqis were opposed to the regime of Saddam Hussein. Yet it was the Iraqi people who defeated the US occupation. There were several points where people talked about kind of different forms of competition. I just want to highlight, I also agree with the point the comrade made about the hypocrisy over nuclear arms in the region. And again, the relationship, the role of the spread of nuclear technologies as linked up with the process of both imperialist competition at the top of the system and the way in which it tries to cement in the regional powers, utterly exposes the hypocrisy of claiming that somehow Israel, a nuclear-armed power that got those nuclear weapons in secret and threatens to use, them, is somehow going to make the world safe by attacking the Iranian regime. We should be opposed to the use of any nuclear weapons. There are no nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. It is a shame and a disgrace that Keir Starmer is spending billions of pounds, which he is taking out of our pockets, and killing disabled people by removing their benefits in order to have F-35 jets armed with tactical nuclear weapons. We should be mobilising as a movement to go to Lakenheath, to go to RAF Marham, to say we want to stop those nukes. We will not let this happen in our name, and we will not let the spectre of nuclear war overshadow us again. We will have to take this question up. And that's actually a reason why the question of the interaction between the crisis in British politics and what happens in the region is so important. Comrade there made a point that I very much agree with when talking about some of the challenges in the region, where the levels of international solidarity were not necessarily there at moments of crisis in the past. So one of the tragedies of the 2011 wave of revolutions was that actually it came at a lull, if you like, in the Palestinian revolutionary struggle. I didn't really have time to talk about the way in which the Palestinian revolution developed alongside these revolutionary movements in the rest of the region. But the peaks of the struggle from below in Palestine, for example, the Intifada in 1987, or the Intifada in 2000, or actually also the Intifada, the Unity Intifada in 2021, have taken place at moments when the revolutionary movement outside of Palestine has been at a relatively low ebb. So that is a concrete example where, although you can see the potential for change from below, one of the problems is the lack of fusion between those two kind of dynamics of revolution. I think what we do see, though, at the moment is that the scale of crisis at the moment brings it back onto the table that those could fuse. That although, for example, Egypt labours under enormous repression by the Sisi regime, that the vast majority of people in Egypt are just like us, watching in horror as genocide unfolds over the border in Gaza, and absolutely abhor what their regime is doing as it participates in allowing the genocide to happen. Just as we feel the same when we look at our regime, the Starmer regime. And I want to finish on this point because when we look at what happened at midnight, when we saw the prescription of Palestine action, we see the enactment of very authoritarian policies that could have been taken from the playbook of people like Sisi. We have to understand, we have to defend our right to protest, we have to defend our right to demonstrate and to march and to go to arms factories and to disrupt the flow of weapons to Israel. We have to defend Palestine action. We have to fight so that they are no longer prescribed, and we have to defend the space for dissent and for organisation from below. It's not going to be easy because the state is on the attack against all of us. It is on the attack against the Palestine movement in general. It's on the attack against the climate movement. It's on the attack, it will be on the attack against the peace movement. That is because of the crisis the system has reached a pitch where actually the questions of welfare and warfare are deeply intertwined, as I said. And if we want to resist this, we need to also, as comrades said very, very eloquently in the discussion, we need to learn and take inspiration from the revolutionary movements in the Middle East. Instead of seeing the Middle East as a region just racked by crisis and scarred by war, we also see it as a region fruitful with hope and with visions of an alternative. Regime change, the only regime change that matters, is the one that we make ourselves from below.